All right. Thank you, Jenny. I really appreciate it. My name is Alex. I'm a reporter based out of Providence, Rhode Island for TechCrunch. So I am near-ish to the broader Boston area, though I would say in the Superior State, although we don't need to get into sports teams and other such things this morning. Very excited to be here with Corey, of course, the chairman and CEO of Rapid7. He was president and CEO back when the company went public. So we have him to talk about all things entrepreneurship, investing, building a company, and towards the end, just because for fun, we're going to talk a little bit about the exit market as well. But Corey, just to kick things off, how is life? How are you doing? And how is the end of COVID treating you?
Well, one, I'm thrilled for the end of COVID. You can't see it, but I'm back in my office, brainstorming, whiteboarding with people. And so that's just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it feels surprisingly strange to go outside and actually enjoy life and like have a summer and all these strange things. But that makes it a great time to talk, because I feel like as our individual lives are getting a little bit warmer and a little bit freer, the startup business world is only increasing in temperature as well. So a fine time to check in. And I want to start off with something a little bit off the beaten path for what we're going to talk about mostly, but cybersecurity for founders. I have been reading so much news lately about ransomware attacks and so forth, and we might get to that kind of later on. But I'm curious what advice you might have as a cybersecurity, CEO of a large company, for earlier stage founders about things they should have in mind, probably earlier than they expected, regarding building proper cybersecurity for their startups.
Yeah, so it's very different than when I was actually looking at Rapid7 a few years ago, or parallels before that. One, first and foremost, people are attacking both nation states, but also just criminal gangs are attacking the technology ecosystem. So while you don't have to like overinvest in security technology, you do need to think deeply about security architecture from the start. And I would say that's a fundamentally big shift and big change. Because if you actually take the wrong security architecture approach, it will actually be very costly and also could hurt your reputation later. The second thing that I would say that you have to really think about today is third-party risk. And so if you look at whether it was SolarWinds or whether it was CodeCov, people are attacking the ecosystem. And lots of founders have to focus on using as much of pre-baked technology as they can. You have to start thinking about that as a risk vector. So in your design and your operation and your security, you have to look at that. The last thing I'll say is, this is for founders who've been at it for a little bit, is, we track what threat actors are looking for. And what threat actors really, really want to get is they actually want to compromise you when you're popular, but before you've scaled enough to actually be focused on security. That's when they actually want to get in, understand your environment, and compromise you. So the security equation is different from founders these days. But if you're early stage, I'll focus on architecture and knowing what goes into the code that you're actually building.
So I haven't been surprised to find out that oil pipelines and other relatively antiquated industries are not really where we'd hope they'd be on cybersecurity. But founders tend to be much more technology savvy and so forth. So are most early stage founders doing enough on this subject today, or is it time for kind of a general call to arms for these people?
No, I think it's a general call to arms, not to actually go out and spend like 5-10% of your budget. It's a call to arms to actually take it serious. And the only thing I would probably dispute a little bit, this is based on my own experience, the most technical people are the most overconfident and incompetent at security. And look, I speak of this firsthand. Like, I have engineers who are some of the smartest people in the world. They're like, I'm perfectly sort of like, I know this stuff, I know it in and out, but yet they don't notice their own shortcuts, or they don't notice things. So I would say that, like, just because you're technical, there's an inverse correlation between how technical you are and how likely you are to overestimate your security capability.
We'll call it the Corey Thomas rule. Be dumb and take that approach to cybersecurity, because you're probably making some mistakes. Okay, so I want to put that aside for now. We'll get back to cybersecurity later on, but I want to dig into a lot of early stage topics, thinking about the founders in the audience and kind of what we can mine from your experience that might apply to them, because you're also an active investor through a couple of groups in the area. So you have a pretty good, I think, finger on the pulse of not just the Northeast, but the broader startup scene. So one thing that I've heard from, I want to say nearly every single seed stage company that I've talked to in the last 6 or 8 months has been that they're now default global and almost default remote. On the other hand, we're seeing major tech companies struggle with trying to find a way to bring back at least a chunk of their staff on a regular basis back to the office. And to me, this is kind of a cultural question. How do you approach this as an early stage startup? And is the kind of office culture for these young tech companies moot at this point, in your opinion?
Look, I actually think that we've gone through the industry, technology industry, probably the broader business industry, has gone through waves where like it's all remote, it's all in person. To have culture in person matters. Look, I think the nuance really matters here. I'll also say that I happen to believe in the power of having people come together. Mm-hmm. But there's also very successful companies that have actually been remote. The thing that I would encourage founders to think about is, for you, what is your culture and what creates the experience around your culture? Workplace and the facilities or the how people engage, it should be a reinforcement of your culture, not a distraction from the culture. So at Rapid7, we're going to actually continue to have a big part of our workforce that will come into the office at some times, not all the time. But that's mostly because we actually picked a learning culture that is constantly learning. And the problem with learning cultures, and so we have to actually not just have like Zoom, sort of like information to share stuff. For us, it's hugely important is if we don't have lots of stability in sort of like we're going from here to here. If ours is like, listen, we're going in this direction, but we're going to actually put milestones and way stations along the way, then what's really important is we do that evolution together. And so we've always had offices all around the world, and we've also had a higher than average travel budget. So for us, that's important. I would say for lots of companies, you're going to find that there's going to be a lot of companies that get started now, and they're going to actually start completely remote. And at some point, as they're scaling, they're going to actually come all back in. And so it's going to change and ebb and flow, but it always has changed and ebb and flow is my response.
I suppose I'm not that surprised to hear you have a general office bias, just given the size of your company. And it sounds like what you're saying is a lot of these earlier stage companies will start remote, will start kind of global first, if you will. They're kind of these micro multinationals, I like to call them. Yep. But over time, as they expand, as they want to reinforce particular cultural tenets, they might, gravitate more towards an office model. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I would say that there's a couple different things. One is there's a couple catalysts that sometimes make it easier to actually gravitate. Again, I've known some companies that have actually done it sort of like remote the whole time.
Yeah.
Is, one of the things that you actually have that actually makes it easy to gravitate is once you have your business and you're scaling and you go from 50 to 100, but you're starting to add you're going from 100 to 200 to 300 to 400. When you're doing that, then you actually have to say, how do I actually make sure that as I'm bringing in, is there's more new people in my company the next year than are here this year? Right. Well, then you start to care a lot about basically how do I make sure that those new people aren't bringing in their past company's culture with them, that they're really sort of living into our culture. And so you have to nurture that, and you have to actually think about that. You have to look at that. There's many ways to do it. But one of the ways that people do is they actually bring people together and have them spend time together.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the cultural kind of people bringing their own culture in. I had a friend who was working at one of the, let's say major American scooter companies when they were going through their hypergrowth. Yeah. And this company hired a bunch of people from Uber and essentially poisoned its internal culture on a very rapid basis. And they just weren't taking care of bringing their own values to the table, and were kind of overwhelmed by Uber detritus, really.
And I think Alex, you nailed the point. The point isn't really remote, non-remote, all this, all that. The point is, what are you doing to make sure that you're reinforcing your cultural values? And the more you scale and the faster you scale, the more that has to be an intentional exercise. If you do that, then there's many right answers about how you achieve it.
Okay, so I want to drill down on the culture point a little bit, because I've actually gotten to be part of a startup that was defining its cultural values and kind of got to go through that internal process. And also I read a lot of S1 filings, and companies love to put their values up at the top. And everyone has the same, I swear to you, Corey, 6 values. It's like customers are important. Be nice, work quickly. And so to me, what we've really substituted in for culture is we like to do business well. And so I'm curious how you define culture and how the founders that are with us today might want to approach the topic in a way that's a little bit more than 4 bullet points on a slide that they then show off occasionally when they try to hire people.
Yeah, I take both a pragmatic but also an academic definition of culture. So Shine did lots of the earlier works on organizational culture. I think his book was called Organizational Culture. But the core of it is, what do we believe together? So it really has to be a shared belief. Not what do you say, but what do people truly believe? And I'll give you some examples in a second. The other one that I'm a big fan of is, how does what we believe interact with how we behave in good times? But for me, what's most important is, how do we behave in bad times? Like, how do we behave under distress? So for Rapid7 and again, it's not what you write down, it's sort of like how you behave. What we aspire, and I use aspire intentionally because we have to constantly reinforce it, constantly nurture it, is we want a creative learning culture. So we want a culture that's all about basically learning and evolving. So what we want to believe is that no matter where we are today, is we're going to actually navigate and learn faster than the other companies and maintain our relevance. How the speed of our learning and how we apply learnings is what allows us to maintain our relevance. Now, let me talk about why I focus on sort of like how you behave under distress. Is one of the changes that I actually had to make early on when I was actually looking at this was that when we were under distress, we had this training, and we had a part of our team that used to do this thing called precision questioning. And it was all about, when things go wrong, you figure out the issue. So it was like lightning fast, sort of like a questioning sort of mentality.
Yeah.
And so when we bring people on, and we had some people, by the way, that brought from their old companies. We had one guy, I remember, a senior leader, who was like, I actually drive accountability. That sounds great. Doesn't that sound amazing? I keep
sign me up. Yeah.
And I hold other people accountable. The challenge is, and this is where the rubber hits the road when things aren't going well, is that when you're actually driving accountability under distress, that discourages learning. And so part of what we actually had to actually separate out is that when we're under distress, we're asking the question, what's happening and why? And we're exploring the issues of what's happening around us. We hold accountability for later. Now, in some ways, you can argue that that made us a less accountable culture, and we actually had to de-emphasize that. And so an attribute of culture is you have to talk about things, ideals that you actually like, but you're de-emphasizing. So we de-emphasize the accountability of who screwed up. Sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
So we de-emphasize when something goes wrong. It's not about who screwed up. It's about what's happening, why is it happening, what are we going to learn from it, and how are we going to use this learning to be twice as better in the future.
Got it.
That's what a culture is. It's about what do we believe is the key to our success, and how do we behave, and how does that behavior instantiate, especially under stress. That's my definition of culture.
Okay, so a couple of things. One, we have some questions coming in from the audience. What I'm going to do is hit those at the end. So if we don't get to your question right after you submit it, just keep in mind that I see them, and we are going to hit through as many of those as we can in a little bit. So just patience, and we'll get there. Corey, back to you. On this point, one last tiny question about culture, because I've been tracking with as much care as I can the movement amongst certain technology companies to move to what they call or consider to be a politics-free environment. And this has been controversial. And my personal 2 cents, just to kind of tell you where I'm coming from, is that it's kind of a ridiculous proposition, because what's defined as politics is essentially just the CEO's politics are correct and everything else is outside the orbit of what's allowed for discussion. Do you see this trend spreading amongst other startups? And if you're willing to step in on this, what's your perspective on it?
Yeah, so one, I actually think it's a genuine struggle about how to actually keep it where teams and organizations remember that we're better together. And so how do you keep diverse teams? If you're going to have diverse teams that may have diverse political views, how do you actually keep it where people actually work together and respect one another? That said, I actually think the attempt to actually solve that problem with a politics-free culture is clumsy.
Yeah.
And so, I'll give you the answer that I actually have. It's sort of like twofold. It's the first and foremost things is an acknowledgement that every organization is going to have people that believe different things, and that's okay. So, I said I have a specific set of beliefs, and I'm happy to share them. But part of what we have to do is say it's okay to actually believe different things. That is a fundamental part of Western liberal philosophy, or whatever you actually want to call it.
Sure.
It's okay to actually believe different things. And while I might have a strong set of beliefs, we have to actually make that okay. So I just start with that. The other thing that I emphasize is that the opportunity that we have is to set an example about, like, if we can't actually be an example of how people can actually believe different things, but then come together and create a better experience for society. And that means come together and actually create a better experience for how people work together. Come together and create a better experience for our customers. Come together. If we can't do it, then how are we actually expecting other people to do it? With that, then the tone is sort of like what's permissible and what's not permissible. Anything's permissible as long as it's respectful and values other people. Now, there's also some things about like that we do sort of exclude, and I have to exclude myself from it. So like, a friend of mine who's running for office wanted to hold an event. I'm like, listen, I can rent out a restaurant, but I can't do it at the office. Right. You can't really have like fundraisers at your office. If you do it, it's got to be cool for everyone to do it. But that doesn't seem like that's sort of like, for me, that's a no. We don't do political fundraisers at the office. We don't do flyers. We don't do something. That's not a politics-free environment. That's just a standard about like how do you use space, and what do you actually use space for. But for me, those are my sort of like guidelines. It's just like it's okay to actually have different views. We should be setting a standard for how people actually do that. Yeah. And then from there, sort of like be cautious and conscientious and think about your impact on others.
My last 2 cents on this is you talked a lot about respect, getting along and working together. And in my view, our ability to do that and what defines conscientious behavior is often determined by political progress. And one thing that I was a little bit disappointed by was how Coinbase, for example, said, we're a politics-free culture, but also we're not going to be homophobic. We're not going to be sexist. Things that were earned in the workplace through politics. And so to me, I'm like, okay, cool. So politics means everything that's not the past. It seemed clumsy. I think it's a very polite way of describing this. But Corey, let's move on and talk about sales. Yeah. Oh, no, please.
Yeah, no. I was going to say, well, I think this is relevant because I think lots of, especially, I think early, this is a new thing that lots of CEOs are dealing with. And so I think it's a worthwhile sort of like topic. The one advice I have is sort of like, don't run from it.
Got it.
I think that I think running from it is problematic. I'll just provide one example. So we had an example of a media company that was and I'll just say it was a very, very conservative media company that happened to be a customer. I didn't even know they were a customer. We have lots of customers, and we had some people that were very, very upset about it. And by the way, I didn't agree with lots of the views, but they wanted to actually sort of like say like they shouldn't actually be a customer. Yeah. And so instead of running away, we sat down and had a conversation about like who deserves security versus not, and who gets to set the standards for that. Yeah. And I said, listen, well, I'll have the conversation, but you got to come in and say who deserves it and who sets the standards. And so we ended up having a conversation, and it ended up through the conversation, through the views, it sort of came out. People were like, well, we want sort of like you to have the values and sort of like you have that. I said, that's great. So you want my personal values to set the standard of everything the company does. So anything I believe, you're going to be like, no, we're not quite comfortable with that. We're comfortable with it because we think you agree with us in this case. And I'm like, okay, is that a good governance model? And so it turned out that like the discussion enriched everyone about how we had it and how we actually think about setting standards. It wasn't an avoidance thing. It was about like, how do we actually want to treat this? But engagement matters is the other thing that I want to just emphasize.
Yeah. Sadly, we had to move on to talk about other things. I think you and I could talk about this for the next hour because it's one of the most interesting, I think, business questions in the tech world. But there are other things going on. And one thing that I wanted to riff on with you was sales. Talking to a lots and lots of early stage founders who are kind of debating between going a traditional SaaS model versus more of an on-demand pricing setup. And this seems to be kind of a conversation that many startups are having because SaaS has become the default startup business model in many cases. And there's this kind of new push towards more on-demand pricing. So I'm curious from your perspective as both a CEO and someone who invests, which way are startups trending more? And do you think that they're approaching the question in the right mindset?
Yeah, so I would say don't follow trends that you don't understand. I would say try to understand it. And so here's my take on the demand is it works as long as customers don't view it as too expensive or they have the predictability and visibility. So I'm not quite sure on demand works at scale. because if you look at some of the on-demand pricing models, when they cause cost volatility to customers, it ends up being a massive distractor. And so the thing that, when we look at it, I'm open to on-demand, but I've had discussions with my team. I'm like, tell me how we actually give customers visibility into their cost on the customer's budgetary schedule. Because again, we're customer facing. So if we're going to do that, it's not about our business model, it's about what really works for the customer. I think if people do that, they'll be fine. And there's a lot of ways to approach it, but I would say really approach it from what's likely to happen in the customer's behavior.
I got it. It's interesting. I've heard some CEOs describe this to me as larger clients, customers really prefer SaaS because they want to lock in a dollar amount that they can put in their budget for the year. Whereas some SMBs appreciate a little bit more flexibility so they can essentially save money on some months. And I've also heard explained the other way around. So I'm still trying to figure out exactly what different cohorts want.
And so I think in general, what people want to do, and we're working on our own thing there. They don't want to actually pay for something they're not using, and they won't budgetary visibility. So for me, our goal is sort of like pay for what you use and have budgetary visibility. That's the pricing and packaging goal that our team has.
Okay. On the sales point, we're also hearing a lot more about people working on kind of demand gen based marketing, a slight maybe de-emphasis on the enterprise sales model. And I'm curious about, if you think that startups moving more away from traditional sales, as you and I understand it, is something that is going to keep happening, or if we're seeing just kind of a gyration in how startups approach sales more generally.
No, I mean, look, we were one of the early companies that went to a inside sales model as the predominant thing, and I would say a targeted outside sales model. And we're looking more and more about how to actually deliver experiences that make sense for customers, whether it's electronically or otherwise. And it's less about cost, it's more about sort of like, what are customers looking for? So for example, is that right now to actually get add-on services, we're actually looking at a system where customers can request it if they're interested in, but they can also just purchase it through the product if they want to purchase it through the product.
Right.
This is a big evolution because what's really changed is customers are doing lots of self-exploration. Now, I would say the caveat is the proliferation of choices that customers have still requires salespeople to get through the noise. And so this is one where you'll ebb and flow over time about like, do you have the awareness that you actually need? And if you don't have the awareness, then you got to find ways to get that awareness. That's sales and marketing versus how do you actually make sure that you're supporting, you don't actually constrain customer engagement by they have to interact with your sales team.
Okay. I want to move us along and hit on as many topics as we can. And one thing that you and I talked about when we had a quick chat prepping for today was the venture capital market writ large, and especially how it relates to the Northeast. I think by now everyone's pretty aware that 2020 wound up being a surprisingly lucrative year for startups raising money, especially in the back half of the year. I'm curious how the current state of affairs on the venture capital side compares to kind of right before COVID last year. So not exactly a year ago, more like, 15 months. Are things more active? Are they more risk on? Are people getting more conservative? Where do we stand today?
I think it's a lot more active. I think the primary driver was, and you see this in tech industry in general, is COVID in general created a greater reliance and therefore investment in technology just around the world. So if you look at aggregate demand for technology, it increased. Mm-hmm. And so if you're an LP, you're like, I want to be more into sort of like technology. And so therefore it's easier for venture capital firms to raise money. And if you're a venture capital firm, you say, oh, things are accelerating. And so therefore I want to be looking at things. And so you've seen this steady pickup, but that's because if you say like, is the world more technologically dependent today versus a year ago? The answer is clearly we're actually trending towards more technological dependency at a faster rate today.
This brings me to my next question, which is about some of the late stage money that we've seen pouring into increasingly early stage companies. And I'm kind of thinking about Tiger Global as an example of the trend, though certainly not the only player who has a large fund and is investing relatively early. I'm hearing from some VCs that Tiger will show up and put $30 million into a company with between 500K and 1.5 million ARR, which implies a valuation to revenue multiple that's aggressive even for today's standards. So have things gotten a little bit crazy, or are things still within the bound of reasonableness, if you will?
No, I think, look, things are probably a little, I would say in general, and well, let me give a caveat because could be a global audience. In the US, you could argue that in the tech sector in general, things are getting a little bit hot. The engine's getting a little bit hot. Employment's getting a little bit hot. The cost of tech talent's getting a little bit hot. Especially for companies that have a modicum of success, the prices are starting to rise a little bit. Is it out of bounds? Probably not in aggregate. Are there going to be lots of sort of like not great investments? Probably. That happens all the time.
Yeah.
It's hard to pick on any one strategy and say what's the driver of it. But I would say in general, to your core question, is the overall tech engine starting to warm up some? And I would say, yeah, it's probably getting a little bit hot in general. You see that reflected in tech talent too.
Oh no! I mean, everyone's trying to hire the same 48 engineers, it feels, or machine learning specialists. I don't know how we haven't solved that talent crisis yet, but it seems to be more exacerbated than ever. Though, just thinking about the people that are with us today and the early stage founders, there's a reasonable chance they're going to end up across the table from a late stage fund trying to put in a large check, an outsized check into their business at some point. Generally speaking, what's your advice to companies that are offered more money for their kind of current maturity that they would normally access? Pro, con, a risk worth taking?
I would say I would be cautious. So like, look, my take is that especially when you're in the earlier stages, it's one, in this environment too, you can get money, but like the people that you're in business with matters. So I've always been a big fan of like who I'm actually in business with hugely matters, because while I'm optimistic in general, I expect in any 5-year period, things are going to go to hell, right? And so I'm always looking at everything about like, all right, when things get upside down, who is it that I actually want to actually be partnered with?
Right.
And I think that if you let the valuation drive that, you'll be one of the many unhappy companies. Now, again, valuation has to be reasonable, but I've always in my life taken a reasonable valuation from people that I thought it was great to actually be in a crisis with than the best valuation. Now, if it was 100% difference, I completely get it. If it was 50% difference. But if it's 10, 20%, then I'm actually picking the people over the dollars every day of the week.
Thinking about your time at the head of Rapid7, I think you started as an SVP, then you were president CEO, now you're chairman and CEO. You helped the company go public. How important was your preceding valuation that you kept at a reasonable level when you got to the actual IPO stage? Did that matter?
So for me, I'm always like, I want employees to win at every level. And I want investors to win. So to me, it's about like, we're doing it for the customers, but if there's a payoff, employees should win and investors should actually win. The problem with actually spiking your valuation too early is you actually end up necessarily not doing the best thing for employees who are joining right after that.
Yes.
Because as you actually get ready to go out, you sometimes have a compression of the prices the public markets are paying versus the private markets, or the sales price versus that. And so especially if you're using options, then you've actually acted against the interest of your employees. So I've always thought carefully about like who all the stakeholders are. And I want to make sure that there's actually a high likelihood of success at every level. And so that's my 2 cents. It's like I'm a little bit cautious on big spikes that I don't believe can continue. I'm completely fine with sort of like steady growth, but I want everyone I'm hiring to actually win so that we all win together. So
I want to flip this around a little bit. We've been talking about startups that are the most attractive, that have traction, that's really attracting a lot of eyeballs. But there's also a group of technology companies that are smaller, that are growing at 45% a year, 55% a year, rates of growth that are super solid, healthy margins, great companies, but don't really hit that present day venture capital expectation of kind of minimum 100% growth if you're less than 50 million ARR. So for companies like that might be tuned in today, there are a plethora of other capital options. There's, revenue-based financing. There's whatever the hell Pipe is doing. Still don't really get that. What direction do you tell people that they might want to look if they're kind of falling just short of the venture capital landscape today?
Yeah, if they're not hyper growth, I think today you actually have probably a wider wealth of options than you've ever had before. In addition to going public, in addition to selling, which are always there, you actually have a much more fertile market to sell to other private equity firms. There's lots of them out there. So the same caveat is be cautious and thoughtful about who you partner with, but there's some great firms and there's probably some challenging firms. Likewise, you have other ways to actually go public either through mergers or SPACs or other things. And so you just have a much wider selection. My advice to folks is always to be clear about what they really want to do. understand what their trajectory and the capacity are, and then pick the option that actually makes the most sense. There's a reason that you're actually seeing companies go public later in general. And that's because the expectations that public investors have are just sort of like have steadily moved up over time. But filling in that gap, you have quite a robust private market that's developing even more. And so I encourage people to look at it, but think carefully about their partners.
3 or 4 years ago, I don't think private equity would have come up in this conversation regarding kind of like early to mid-stage startups. But certainly today, given the prices PE is willing to pay and how much capital they have and how much they're showing up, I guess it is part of the conversation now.
It is part of the conversation. It's an option.
Yeah. So selfishly, what do you think about Apollo? Because they're buying me. And so I want to take 10 seconds and hear your take about them. Good or bad? Don't worry, you're only on the record and on video.
I'm only on the record now. Exactly. Look, I am actually, so I don't know them well because they have not done lots of stuff in the, the way I find out about these friends in the tech space that's actually there. I don't know their track record as an investment firm is pretty good. What I do, so my advice to you is the thing I tell every entrepreneur is I cold call when someone approaches or someone's asking me, I say, go cold call the companies that have been in their portfolio or that were in their portfolio and see what the experience was like. You get the best insight from people that were there and are no longer there.
All right. And then for startups that might get approached by a private equity firm early, have the multiples that private equity firms are offering kind of middle stage startups, are those attractive now from the venture capital perspective? Have they kind of reached parity, or are those still going to be discounted enough that they're dangerous?
Look, they have. I think part of this is having great relationships with your current investors. Yeah. Look, your current investors are going to send you signals about whether they're bullish or not bullish. By the way, it's okay to disagree with them. I've had disagreements. Look, Rapid7 was not supposed to be a public company. It was not supposed to be a $4.5 billion, $5 billion company. It was supposed to get sold at like $200 million. But like we had some, and so it's okay to have disagreements. You just have to have some substance behind it. And so I would say you will learn a lot. If you're a company that the insiders are unwilling to invest in and you can't actually find venture to extend the runway, then I would say that's a signal. You should listen to it and understand it. And then if you happen to be talking to a PE firm or looking at another strategy or even acquisition, just understand that there's lots of options out there. Yeah. And the key is to go develop options with the high quality people.
All right. Now I want to get to the we have 4 or 5 audience cues that I want to get to, but one last question on the preparation point regarding going public. And I know, again, early stage founders, what are we talking about? Well, it seems that given the SPAC boom, that there are several avenues to becoming public much more early than many companies would have expected 2 years ago. And so for the founders out there who are probably, Series A, Series B, should they be doing earlier work as a corporation to build the internal systems to have the possibility of going public in their mind? Or should they wait till kind of the traditional, I don't know, maybe Series C to begin to hire a CFO and build out the kind of internal controls that they might otherwise want?
Yeah, no, I would say, listen, I would definitely wait till you actually have a quality business that you actually understand the outlook for the next 5 years. Like going public is just it's a financing event. It's a cool financing event, but it's still just a financing event. You will get demolished by going public too earlier, no matter how you actually do it. Now, the fact that you're on the runway and you actually say, what's the most efficient way? I think for some people doing a traditional public offering is perfect. I think for some people, SPACs could actually be perfect. It's just that like you get price certainty, it's less of a hassle, you do some other things. It's a trade-off that you actually have to make. I was highly negative on some of these SPACs earlier on, but I ended up investing in some and talking to some people that actually did it. And I was just like, oh, interesting. Like I did not think about like the certainty value and the time value. Yes. But again, the key is that like you need to actually have a good understanding of your fundamental business dynamics for the next 5 years if you want to go public. It's not too serious.
Yeah. So it sounds like if you don't have that perspective, no matter how attractive a SPAC offering, knocking on your door.
I would not do it. Look, I think the SPACs that actually did it with businesses that were too early are going to fail. And I think that's one of the big negatives about the SPAC market in general is they lacked discipline on quality.
It's almost like fundamentals matter. And that having a business you can really understand is important. I mean, who would have thought, Corey, in this day and age that nothing has changed? Okay, let's grab some questions from our friends who are with us today. Kicking off with Ian Pointer. This goes back to the first thing we talked about, which was office culture and so forth. Oh, there it is right there. How do you square the view that I am hearing from many CEOs about being in office with the surveys I'm seeing that say half or more employees are planning to quit if they can't work remotely? What's driving this disconnect between workers, say, and management?
Yeah, so I will actually speak to it directly because we're actually in the heat of these conversations. I think that this requires sort of like not an absolutist view. It requires a discussion about like what are people trying to get and what are the achievements that there. So I'll highlight three factors that I think are happening. One is I think lots of workers are reasonably saying, listen, I'm having a great experience not commuting. And our companies have been successful. Those are the two critical price points. Is I'm having a great experience and the companies are been successful. I think CEOs, I can actually split. I can actually speak for myself here. Is I would say that is absolutely true. Lots of Rapid7's workers are actually having a really, really great experience. Lots of the new employees I had in the last year not having a great experience. So sometimes there's actually data that's actually not there that actually gets missed. And so all the stuff that actually went into the culture, the understanding, has allowed people that actually have relationships and context and all that other stuff to be good. And for people that are actually trying to learn it remotely and get ingested in, now there's many ways to tackle it, but that's an important factor. The second thing that I've looked at when I talk to my employees, I said, listen, we have a bias towards promoting from within. It's a lot harder to actually have a first-time manager actually do that as a remote experience. And people are like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. And so I'm just like, these are things that I'm thinking about and that I'm actually looking at. And so, but it does require, again, engagement and not absolutism. And then the last thing is change management is something that we actually have to figure out. It's achievable to do it remotely, but it's actually harder. These are the reasons you actually see tensions that are actually there. The last one, I think that is probably underappreciated, so I'll say it here with some reservation, is part of it is, at least for myself and a small group of CEOs, they have lots of commitment to the areas. It is really hard to justify shifting to all remote and actually still hiring tech workers in San Francisco, Boston, and Austin. And so one of the things that is unintended consequences, my take is if we did all remote, the world would be better off because we would hire people from anywhere. And some people say that's good, but that's not necessarily beneficial for folks in some of the big tech cities.
Right. And the point that you're gently alighting there is that if you can hire someone who wants to work remote in Nebraska for 100, it's much harder to budget in 200 for someone in Boston. Yeah. As a long-term remote employee, this is pertinent to my interest. And I understand what you're saying. But I got to say, Corey, I'm kind of mad because you keep asking for nuanced conversation and discussion when you could be giving me spicy sound bites. And how dare you be mature, sir? I mean, come on. All right, let's grab another one. Haley Bregman, if we can get that one pulled up. Great. Do you think all cultures are as unique as they think they are, or they're really just a couple of flavors of culture? And Corey, before you respond, I think there's like 2 flavors of culture in startups, but I'm curious what your take is.
Well, I think so. I've looked at lots of research on it. I think there's actually 6 to 8 flavors, depending on how you actually look at it. And this is, again, both the beliefs and the behaviors. So you actually have the learning, which is the one that we use, which is actually not that frequently used. And I talked about like why you have to actually trade off. You have results driven cultures, which are just about like, the results are the dominant thing that actually happen. And they're flexible on a whole bunch of other things. Control cultures, which is about sort of like power dynamics, which I tend to look down on. But if you're in a precision manufacturing, then you probably want a control culture, right? Like every culture sometimes has a fit where it actually works well. You have, I forget what it's called. I call it collaboration cultures, where decisions are made and it's about how you actually get consensus and how you reach decisions. So again, I could go on, but like those are just some of the samples. So I would say like, no, it's not a unicorn, but there's more than you would actually think. And they actually have in practice in how they're lived, real trade-offs between the different cultures about how decisions are made and how they respond to crisis and which one's suitable where.
Not to give you homework, Corey, but I would read that post if you wrote it.
Okay.
with all the different cultures? Because I think I agree fundamentally that there are more cultures than just kind of two, but I'm curious how many of them end up in kind of the startup matrix of decisions and how many of them might get selected. And I wonder if that's a smaller number to Haley's point.
Yep, I think I think it is a smaller number. I still think I looked at this before. I think it's 3 to 4, but I'll actually pull it. There's been some great. I'm using other people's research for what it's worth. I wish I could quote them because I can't remember off the top of my head. But I'll happily send it to you and share it.
Totally. Let's go ahead and grab Aodell's comment. Here we go. In terms of the discussion on setting standards, how do you actually find your limit in terms of a partner that might not be good to work with due to team moral or company image? Probably team morale. How do you find the balance? So I think this is in response to your note on the conservative media company. I'm going to go ahead and just guess Breitbart that you were working with and had to have that internal conversation about. And
so the question is how I set how you figure out how to set the standards in terms of.
Well, let me frame it to you this way. Conservative media site. I can see the conversation inside the company. Neo-Nazi website. Probably not going to be a long conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And so and this is actually, I think this is actually the core. So the way that I actually set this, so the way that we actually set the standards is we actually have a permissive standard that actually says we don't want any one or small set of people to actually decide. The other thing that we actually do that actually makes it relatively simple is that we should also, because we have very disparate views, but we actually have enough commonality, is that it should not be hard and we should not take a lot of time to actually decide something's fundamentally bad. So to your point is that basically, so if something's in the gray area, you know it's in the gray area. Neo-Nazi websites, not in the gray area. There's no one that's actually saying that's in the gray area. So like, let's not overcomplicate it either. And then let's be willing to have a discussion about some things that are in the gray area and they actually are in the gray area. But we actually have a clear standard that says, like, listen, in general, we don't want to actually, and so our standard was, in general, we don't want to actually censor, but we're going to agree that we're going to have discussions and we're going to actually bring up things that we actually think should be beyond the pale. And we can actually do that, and that's approachable.
I mean, for example, every company is going to go ahead and say, we're not going to host, support, platform illegal activity. So everyone has a minimum standard of being booted. The question is just how much more strict are you willing to be? Yeah. And, you know, much like the culture questions and much like the remote work thing, there's not a single answer to this.
There's not a single answer. But this is why, look, if you want to have a great team, the process of how you engage with the team really matters.
Yeah.
And so, like, I have to remind myself, well, I might have an opinion. You can't be high-handed about it. You have to actually be willing to engage again and again and again. And I think that's the hard thing that people forget.
I mean, that requires a level of patience that I still aspire to as someone who likes to.
It is hard, but like it's important though, because like how you engage matters. And by the way, it's not just how it matters about how people think about you. It actually creates better decisions. Because that process does create better decisions.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. We're going to grab one more from the audience, and then I have one to wrap us up, and then we got to go. Amazingly enough, time flies. But from Colin Duggan, let's get that one pulled up on the screen. Interesting discussion on culture. How does Rapid7's learning culture relate to innovation, and how do you create an environment for innovation? And then, Corey, just adding to this, people often talk about how you have to have the ability to overhear someone at the water cooler to have an innovative culture. I'm curious if you also agree with that perspective.
No, so I'll tell you again, the water cooler thing. So so the learning culture actually, I think, is supportive of innovation because in general, it says that while we want to go somewhere, it acknowledges that we don't know how we get there. So if I think about innovation requires lots of space because the way that you create something new is you minimize preconceptions. You open up the aperture. So the more you actually have constrained thinking, the least likely you are to do meaningful innovation. So the benefit of a learning culture is it comes in, and we test for this, with a bias towards people that are curious and a demanding expectation that says, we don't know how the world works, we're just trying to figure it out.
Yeah,
that is a great sort of like fertile ground for innovation. So I think about the learning culture creates the fertile ground for innovation. You still have to actually go do the technical innovation in our case.
So if learning culture allows for innovation, then I would presume that Oracle and IBM don't have the strongest learning cultures.
No. Well, I would say it's not the only way to do innovation.
Right. I'm being a brat. I understand.
Exactly. Yes. Shockingly, I tell people all the time is that people talk about control cultures. If you actually happen to have a genius who's in control, then you can have great innovation. And we know a couple of those companies and founders. It's just that most of us, I'm definitely not a genius that could actually that could actually pull that off.
This is the problem with everyone trying to imitate Steve Jobs, because
Steve
they're
Jobs,
not Steve
Elon
Jobs.
Musk, they're just, look, I'm just there's so few people out there that are like that. Why would you? So that doesn't work for me. So I have to actually have a different way to create an innovative environment, because I'm not that level of genius.
Yeah.
You had another question that was actually part of that.
The importance of in-person.
The water cooler thing. So look, so my take is on innovation. It actually comes from not just the exchange, but the pressure of different ideas and perspectives and attention. This brings in the whole diversity thing too, about how people engage different backgrounds, different thoughts, different perspectives. Our best ideas come from the challenging of I have to process, to think, and engage differently. The thing that I would say is it's not so much about the water cooler. Is if you think about the preconditions in my mind, is you have to actually have ideas that have tension and are pressure tested, and you have to have a high trust environment. Why is a high trust environment important? Because high trust creates the vulnerability where people are willing to show ideas that are half-baked. Yeah. And so if you're going to have an environment that is high trust, where people are showing ideas that are half-baked, and you're actually going to actually bat around those ideas and do that stuff, the only thing I would say is it's really hard to do that virtually, unless you've already created that trust there. And so if you say I'm going to add a half of the team that's actually new, and I'm going to actually require vulnerability, and I'm actually going to have this things where things are batted around and tested. I would just say that is hard to do in a complete remote setting with people that don't have pre-existing trust.
Yeah. Is it possible to have an accountability culture and a high trust culture at the same time?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think while there's some tensions, because remember, so much of it is about how people actually do it. But accountability just ensures that. Now, if you say is it possible to have a teaming culture and accountability culture, that gets harder, because part of accountability culture is a lot of clarity about who's accountable, and the willingness to take responsibility for it. But you can do that in trust, because as long as you actually are doing what you said you're going to do, right, and if you don't do it, you own it, then I trust you. And so you can actually have that's actually there. That does not require, accountability culture does not require people to be jerks. That's why I say all of the cultural norms are actually, they're neither negative or positive. They're just what they are.
Okay. We have to stop. So my last question that I can't not ask, because I'm so curious. Ransomware, lots of discussions today about, does cryptocurrency make ransomware more possible, more feasible? Can the government crack down on crypto? Should it? I'm just curious about your 2 cents about the current dialogue around crypto's ransomware and cybersecurity in general.
Well, we had espionage and theft for a long time. Yes. And we knew how to deal with that. I've always feared that sabotage and ransomware associated with sabotage was going to escalate, and I think it's escalating. That's a major escalation and a major problem. We have to deal with that differently. The other aspect that I would actually say to your direct question is, there's lots of debates about whether you should enable ransomware or not. I did take a more, again, nuanced view. The one thing that I'm pretty sure should probably happen is that we should not enable unregulated financial markets. And that does not mean, by the way, that it's anti cryptocurrencies. Sure. What it means is that if you actually think about it, we have prohibitions about funding terrorist organizations right now. And so with cryptocurrency that actually has no tracing and no accountability, it is possible to actually fund tyrannical regimes. It's possible to fund terrorist organizations, and all of that stuff's already illegal. And so I think you're going to see a reasonable movement, and I've shifted my position here over time, where people actually are going to actually move away from enabling financial transactions where you actually don't know the counterparty, and you can't attest to it at least.
If there was a way to bring KYC to crypto, to your broader point, I'm totally in favor of it. I do see a long-term tension between decentralized finance, or DeFi, and the ability for companies like Coinbase to have KYC. But again, a question we could spend all day on. We are over time, so I have to let you go, Corey. Thank you for the chat, and eventually we should hang out in person now that we're.
I would love that. Now that
we're
we're all in good shape, so that's great.
Yeah, I'll get off the Peloton and on the train. Anyways, thank you, and thanks to everyone else. Jenny, thanks for having us out.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Corey. Thank you, Alex. Learned a ton. Really appreciated the dialogue on culture, on going public, and everything else that you covered. Really great to see you and have you engaged, Corey, as always. And thank you for everyone that joined us. Really appreciate having you all.